Welcome to Popcorn Psychology, the podcast where we watch blockbuster movies and psychoanalyze them. My name is Brittany Brownfield, and I'm a child therapist, and I'm joined by...
Ben Stover, individual therapist.
Hannah Espinoza-Rimas, marriage and family therapist.
We are all licensed clinical professional counselors, aka therapists, who practice out of the Ardent Counseling Center in Chicago. Even though we are licensed mental health professionals, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes and fulfill our love of dissecting pop culture in all forms. The darkest souls are not those which choose to exist within the... Hannah! I covered my face! I'll start over. The darkest souls are not those which choose to exist within the hell of the abyss, but those which choose to break free from the abyss and move silently among us. Dr. Samuel Loomis, also known as the psychiatrist from Halloween. You have anything to contribute, you two over there?
No.
So today, we'll be talking about Halloween, both the original 70s Halloween with Jamie Lee Curtis and the remake by Mr. Zombie, Rob Zombie. So I'm sure everyone's pretty familiar with this movie. It's our third Halloween movie, so we figured we'd finish it off with the official Halloween movie. So basically, I guess I should say we chose to do both, the original and the remake, because the remake by Rob Zombie has way more of like actual clinical terminology, has actual background to Mike Myers, why he might be the way he is. You see him a lot in the institution, whereas in the original just starts with like institution, escapes out of the institution, and he just like exists as like, I think even in the credits for the original, he's just called the Shape. He doesn't even given a name. Right,
yeah, they definitely didn't give him a name. He's just this evil force that exists as evil to be a slasher. And this is the start of the whole slasher trend. This movie in 1978 started the trend of all the movies that would terrify all of us through the early 90s. And all of the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and Hellraiser, like all of those started because of this movie.
Yeah, and so basically what we're going to touch upon, which is why I started with that dramatic-ass quote, is because one of our topics, well, our first topic will be conduct disorder versus dissociation or dissociative symptoms caused by trauma. We're going to kind of debate those two disorders and kind of what we think is best represented in this movie via Michael Myers. And then we're also going to talk about Dr. Loomis and how basically the fact and fiction of his betrayal, because the quote I read at the onset was by Dr. Loomis, and I think is a good example of what we're going to be really breaking down, which is he is very dramatic and says things that I don't know if I would ever hear a credible psychiatrist or psychologist or therapist say aloud.
No. No, we can start with that. No, Dr. Loomis is full-on garbage. And then we're also going to take a second to talk about, when we talk about the nature versus nurture kind of argument with Michael Myers, we're going to take a second to talk about the ACES scale and how that might apply here. So,
jump right into it. So, Michael Myers, I guess in the first movie, is kind of portrayed, like I kind of said, doesn't really have any. We know he was an institution. We know he murdered just his sister?
Yeah.
In the first movie, at the age of 6.
Correct.
Was sent to an institution where he stayed for 15 years. So he's only 21 when he escapes.
Right.
Yes.
And yeah. And so there's not really a lot of background. There's just a lot of like dramatic statements made by Dr. Loomis to kind of insinuate that he is, I don't know, like born evil, like the good old psychopath term, which isn't an actual diagnosable disorder.
No,
Spoiler
it's definitely
alert.
not a diagnosis. It's not a official term. We hear things like blank, pale, emotionless face with the blackest eyes.
I wrote down this psych doctor's assessment is wild after he said that, because so the movie doesn't really, which is why we chose to do both the remake and the original. It's because the original, in my opinion, doesn't really say anything that is psychiatrically sound.
Yeah, they don't give any kind of background for Michael at all. I mean, even the idea that a 6-year-old would be able to in any way, shape, or form overpower a high school aged girl doesn't even make sense. So I think they did a really good job of making the character iconic and of making the kind of starting the trend of having these kind of movies. I mean, clearly it worked. Clearly people really liked it. But as far as developing him as a character or having any accuracy within which somebody would be treated or the way that the psychiatrist acts is just
because I think
bonkers.
What I noted first off, we'll just jump right into it, because what I noticed first off with the original is we found out he's 6. And one is a very young age to be exhibiting the kind of, I don't know, like antisocial, psychopathic behavior that they're stating. Because
way too young.
And also what really bothered me is it seems like right away in the story, there's just this acceptance that this is just like an evil kid who has no soul. Whereas my first thought was, oh my God, he's 6. Is no one going to ask what happened to this kid? Like, no 6-year-old is that, in my experience as a child therapist. I've worked with kids that are aggressive and can seem maybe malicious, like even younger, like 4, 5, 6.
Yeah.
But those kids aren't created in like a vacuum. Like those kids, which the remake does a good job of kind of giving more credence to this, are usually from abusive homes, trauma homes, usually in homes where aggression is regular thing or the way that a lot of people in their family deal with stuff. And so it's very much modeled by their environment, or it's a way for them to get back in control of an abusive environment.
Yeah. I mean, I think that part of it is I wrote down the same thing in my notes, which is anyone going to ask this little boy what happened to him? Because the 6-year-old doesn't come out with a knife and kill his sister.
And he's not talking.
And he's not
flat.
talking.
Like his affect is, when we say affect is flat, we mean he just has like which is kind of what Lewis says is
a blank
face.
Right.
And you will come across this sometimes, but that's usually indicative of a much bigger issue. Like if a kid, because what we call it in the field is like a discrepancy in, it's something we look for when we work with people, is if there's a discrepancy between what they're doing and what they're saying and how they're coming off. And by that, I mean, like, if someone is telling me a really gruesome story, but they're laughing. Or if someone's doing something very aggressive, but their face is flat.
Yeah.
That is something we do take note of in the field and something we would write in, like, our notes on a client.
And it's usually indicative of a chronic illness when you're not able to emote the proper expressions to the situation. Like if you see a kid who gets enraged and has rageful expressions in the face and that results in violence, you can at least tell that there's some sort of emotional response going on. Where it becomes disturbing and difficult to deal with is when violence happens, but there's no emotional reaction that's appropriate. It's not anger, it's not a rage, it's a flat nothingness. There's no response from the eyes, there's no response from the face, there's just a straight face and action happening. That's when it can become really indicative that something's wrong. And
from what we see in the original, we don't see very much, but they seem to be like, their house is nice. You know what I mean? Like, it seems relatively clean. Like, he looks clean, like little Michael.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like, he doesn't, it doesn't
expensive
look
costume.
like...
Yeah.
Yeah, and so... And they just don't tell you anything, because for a kid that young to do something that violent and then have such a unmatching facial expression, especially if he's not speaking and he doesn't speak at all after that, like something has to be going on in that house. Yeah. And for them to just, it seems really reckless to just paint this little boy as evil, psycho, bad seed type, than for anyone in this movie to be asked, or this universe to be asking, what happened to this kid?
Yeah. And why aren't we talking to the parents? That was the other thing that I noticed. The parents aren't involved in any of this at all. Like,
are we supposed to assume that he killed his parents too?
No, the parents are probably the ones that turn him in. In the original, the parents both meet together, and then in Zombies, the parents get out of the car together and meet him in front of the house.
Oh, right. I thought you meant like Okay. Yeah.
No, the parents
No,
meet
you're right,
him in
you're
front of the
right.
house and ask him what happened when he's standing there with the bloody knife. But then in Zombie's version, his biological dad is dead. Her mom has been dating this asshole drunk.
Abusive.
And I would say, and this is me just kind of maybe nitpicking the story itself, but like if you see like a little kid holding a bloody knife, my first thought wouldn't be, oh, this kid's the one that stabbed him. My first thought would be, oh, this kid picked up the bloody knife after someone else killed his sister and ran away. Especially if the kid's not talking. And they didn't have DNA back in those days in either of the movies.
Yeah.
And so it's wild that everybody in both these stories just assumes that the kid is responsible from jump. Yeah. But that's, I think, more just growing like the mythos of Michael Myers and how he's just like this evil, scary monster. Because I do understand, which is why, as we talked about in, Psycho as well, like this is a movie version of a character and this is a movie version of mental illness. And so it's skewed a little bit just to create this monster character. The zombie remake does more of an effort, I think, to ground it in reality.
Well, I think the zombie version shows you 8 of the 10 ACES questions in the first 5 minutes of the film. Do you want to
jump in and define what ACES is?
I can define. So ACES is the Aversive Childhood Event Scale. And what that is was a major health study that was done, I believe, by Harvard in order to kind of establish a link between childhood traumatic events and the relationship that has with chronic disease later in life. So it's not just mental illness. This scale has been linked to obesity, diabetes, depression, cancer, STD rates, mental illness, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, broken bones, and heart disease. So these types of events, which are 10 of them, which I'll go through in just a second, but these events we see in the Rob Zombie version demonstrated by, I believe the guy's name was Ronnie. We see by
the little boy.
No.
Oh,
the
stepdad.
The stepdad. The prick.
Stepdad.
William Forsythe's character. I believe his name is Ronnie.
Yeah, you're right.
And we established in the family immediately that there's 8 of these 10 things, which is indicative of a pretty high chance that Michael's life is going to be challenging later on. So number 1 is what we see. The first question is they're swearing, put downs, or threats. We see all 3. Mm-hmm. The stepdad threatens Michael. He threatens him with physical harm. He threatens the mom.
What does he tell the mom he's going to do?
Shoot her?
No, he says something crazy that
Stab her in the face.
That you and I both.
He was going to skull fuck her.
Skull fuck her.
That's what he said.
He did. Yeah, he said, "I will skull fuck her."
Because I paused it and was like, "Did he just say he was going to skull fuck her in front of like the kids and shit?"
God and everybody.
Oof. Right, which the only other time I've heard that phrase was just uttered by a drill sergeant saying, "I will gouge out your eyes and skull fuck you" by Arlie Ermey.
Yeah.
And that's it. But so we got number 1, swearing, put downs, and threats. Number 2, physical abuse. It's clear that that's happening in the house. 3, sexual abuse. That is not clear that it's happening to Michael. However, the way that
stepdad looks at that girl,
he makes very inappropriate comments towards the sister.
And then she pretends to whack off that milk bottle in front of Michael, pretending like what Michael's masturbating.
Correct.
Yeah.
There's
very inappropriate.
Very inappropriate. It's not clear that there's sexual abuse. It is clear that there are sexually inappropriate things happening in the house. Mm-hmm. So the next is that did you feel like you got love or support, or that your family supported each other? It is very clear immediately that this family is dysfunctional, and that there's no support,
and that they don't know how to show love.
No,
I mean, eesh.
No, except the mom, but she's clearly overwhelmed. Then, was someone too drunk or too high to take care of you or take you to the doctor? As asking a neglect question. So we've got neglect.
Absolutely.
Now, neglect is obvious in this. They leave him to go trick-or-treating by himself. The stepdad and the sister were both supposed to take him, and both leave him alone to go trick-or-treating by himself.
And he just seems to be alone a lot in general, and usually whenever that happens, because he's 10, he's not really old enough to be left alone that much, and so that is clear neglect that he is just
not old enough to like cook his own dinner and stuff.
Exactly.
Which is the scene we see in the movie where he comes home. Ronnie is passed out drunk, probably.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have any dinner.
Right. Yeah. He doesn't have anything to eat, and he's clearly been out on his own. No one knows where he's at. Loss of a parent through death, divorce, or anything that is one of the factors of ACEs. Was your mother abused? Was there death threats? We see, as
both
we
of those.
detailed, she got threatened with skull fucking. I think that qualifies as abuse. Is there substance abuse in the house? Check.
Yeah.
Is there mental illness at the home? It's pretty clear Ronnie is at minimum depressed and an alcoholic, so check.
And also that the mother probably has some form of PTSD, I would imagine.
Probably.
She's definitely
at the very least,
yeah.
she would probably have some issues with that based on the fact that she's in a relationship like that.
Correct. And then the last one is there a family member in prison? We have no evidence of that with Michael's family that I can recall. Maybe somebody said somebody's in jail, but I don't think so.
I don't think so.
But that puts us at a score of 8 of 10 on ACES, which is really high.
And so clinically, how do we use ACEs? Like, why do we do it?
So the reason why we do that is in order to get a picture of what kinds of trauma might be in this client's life. So what kinds of things do we need to take into account in order to have a trauma-informed treatment plan?
Absolutely.
Because one of the things that people often neglect to do is to incorporate into their conceptualization of a human being, how have the things that affected them impacted their decision-making, their interpretation of events, their interpretation of words, clothes, touch, anything. How might any dysfunction that we see be explained by traumatic events in their life? And so this gives you a good cross-cutting picture of the most common types of trauma that can happen.
And also just helps, I think, it just, besides informing treatment, it also just helps us understand a little bit more and how much of a difference that can make and how we work with someone and how we can help them.
And it kind of, in the terms of Michael, kind of nature versus nurture question of it is kind of almost like the first movie. Wait, not the first movie, the original and the remake. Because in the original, the argument we would probably make based on the little data that we have is that it must be conduct disorder. And I'll go back from that. So both movies uses the term psychopath, I think. I know the remake definitely uses the term psychopath. That's not a term that is really used. It's not a diagnosis we give people. When people say psychopaths in movies, what they're actually usually talking about is what we call antisocial personality disorder, which has all the same traits as what I think people think of as psychopaths. Like kind of, the criminal stuff, not caring about other people, kind of being unempathetic, hurting people, violence.
Hurting animals.
All
Seeing
that kind of
people
stuff.
as a means to an end.
Yeah. And so conduct disorder is like baby antisocial personality. So you can't give anyone a personality diagnosis until they're 18. So prior to that, if they're exhibiting all these behaviors already, you would give them conduct disorder. And so conduct disorder, in the first movie especially, it would probably be my best bet because we just don't know anything about it. And just exhibiting that kind of level of violence and lack of empathy at that age would probably be the only diagnosis that would make sense unless we found out that he was having like commanding hallucinations. And what we mean by commanding is kind of how it sounds, which is your voices in your head are telling you to do something, which can sometimes be violent, which is very scary for both the person hearing them and possibly the people around them. And I know that Ben wants to make the argument that in the remake as well, they do make the case for conduct disorder. So some of the traits of conduct disorder are shown in the movie. One, he hurts animals.
Correct.
And it's definitely an escalating behavior because he goes from rats to cats to dogs and then to people.
Correct. Yeah, I think in Rob Zombie's movie they show. I know, like me, there's gonna be a therapist fight here probably real soon.
Only like a little.
Only a little.
I'm gearing up.
We're gearing up.
Ready.
I can see Hannah getting huffy over here. But with Michael Myers in the Rob Zombie version, we see a couple things like Brittany's talking about. We see harm to animals. We also see cruelty with a weapon to the bully.
We could argue that kid had it coming, but anyway.
I mean,
But
he was.
But he beat him.
It was hard for me to see
but
Spy Kid's kid getting his ass beat.
But I would say, I guess, but the point you're making, even in the case where like maybe the kid instigated it or created that scenario, he goes too far. I mean, he kills him, doesn't he? Kill him?
I mean, it at least appears so.
Like it's very
he
different
beats
to
him
like
unconscious.
He beats him unconscious, so he takes it like way too far.
Yeah.
Even for defending yourself, even for getting back at a bully, he takes it all the way.
I mean, he calculated it. He knew the route home. He had a weapon. He waited for him. And where it gets interesting is that when we're talking about specifiers for conduct disorder, he did one of the things, I swear sometimes with movies that we watch, the director must have like opened the DSM and just read it, although this version didn't come out yet, so maybe not. But one of the specifiers for severe in conduct disorder is stealing when confronting a victim. We see him steal from the kid he's bullying. He takes the picture, granted it's of his mom, but he steals the picture from him when he's beating him up.
I thought that was just because that was like the instigating factor, and he was like, "This
Me too.
bitch isn't gonna have my mom's picture." Like that's what I thought. It was more like this is what my objective was, is to beat you because of this, and then I'm gonna take it back from you.
Sure. I mean, I think it could go either way, but what
is this like an insinuation, the specifier of like taking trophies from victims?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's a
taking
that makes more sense.
dark times.
Or like you. Not only did you beat somebody up just to beat them up, but then you took their wallet because you could.
So it's like an extra.
It's
like,
an extra level.
like
Well, it's an
salt
extra
in the
fuck
wound.
you. Yeah.
But
The person you already killed.
we've got deceitfulness. We've got destruction of property. He's
True.
he's like killing people and taking people's pets.
He destroying that end credit scene. He's like whacking that toy horse in half.
Right. He's breaking things. Serious violations of rules. Like the principal indicates that he's been in the principal's office many times, and there's been lots of issues with him.
He does tell the principal, "Fuck you," in a scenario in which he could have asked the principal for help and made that like a opportunity for change.
Right. And
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if the principal would have taken up on it, but the fact that he just the principal asks what's happening and he just looks dead him in the face and he goes, "Fuck you." Like
Well,
he took
then-
it up the next level.
He did, but also then the mom comes in and talks to the
Tells him
fucking
to fuck
principal, and
you.
she also tells him to fuck off. So I also feel like he doesn't really have any good examples of what to do when confronted, because all he hears is yelling and screaming at his house. So I do kind of feel like his response of "fuck you" in that situation doesn't actually feel that odd, especially based on the fact that he's the one getting bullied, and now all of a sudden he's the one getting in trouble for shit.
Well, in conduct
Right.
disorder, does conduct disorder have like the problem with authority?
yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
right. Yeah.
Yes, and it's oppositional defiant would have that more, but where conduct disorder becomes an issue is you run into having a lack of remorse or guilt, or callous with a lack of empathy. The kid that played Michael Myers in this did an outstanding job at facially acting by showing
good.
nothing. Like he showed no emotion when he was
Well, during the
acting
actual
out.
killing too, like when he was murking his fam in the clown costume and the remake, like flat affect, like
Yeah.
which I thought was an interesting choice, like directorially, because he is so emotive in a lot of the movie. You know, and he's like beating the kid up when his parents are having issues, like even when he's beating to the bathroom, like he has a lot of emotion on his face. So, I mean, I'll bring this up when I make my argument to you, Ben.
Right.
But in this moment when he's killing his family, his face, he doesn't have any, he's very calm in a way that he hasn't been calm in the other parts of the movie.
Right. He's very calm. He's very flat affect, and those are all specifiers. Like we see that he's basically unconcerned about performance. He has a shallow affect. Like he sometimes shows an emotional face, but most of the time his affect is really flat and not responsive to what's going on.
Debatable.
Yeah.
Once he decides that he's going to start killing people, that's it. He kills the boyfriend, no look on his face, kills the father, plans it, tapes him up, shows extreme cruelty in doing so, and then he stabs his sister repeatedly, no emotion the entire time.
You done? Just joking.
Well, and I would also argue that he's probably the most severe with the stepdad, because he's easily probably been the most cruel to him.
Yeah,
Correct.
So I
that's
think
like his
that,
main villain.
So I think that makes sense.
Correct. And then you see deceitfulness. I have one more thing. Sorry. We see the deceitfulness with the mother. Like, he acts like he doesn't remember it. I call bullshit on that. I know you two feel differently, but when he's talking about can I go home, I felt like he was being extraordinarily manipulative, because as soon as he got the opportunity, he stabbed that nurse in the neck.
Well, I
with a
think,
fork.
but here's
He was triggered.
Before
He was
before
triggered.
we jump into
But-
this argument, before me and Hannah attack you.
Yeah.
I think this is a good case of illustrating how subjective mental health can be.
Yeah.
And how
absolutely
10 therapists and 10 psychiatrists can see you and you can get 10 different diagnoses. Because I think's funny about listening to you make your argument about conduct is everything you're saying for conduct, I perceived in a totally different way, and I think Hannah did too, for our argument, which is some sort of dissociative based trauma.
Yeah.
Right, but where it gets where I think that argument loses weight, and not that you don't have valid points, because there are.
We haven't even
I know.
made it yet.
We made him off mic. We made him off mic. I'm sorry.
Oh my god.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Hannah's
front
gonna
load
stab
our
me.
argument by
finish
ripping it apart.
Please,
I'm sorry.
Please finish your statement.
I will finish my statement, and then I will shut up.
Yeah.
Temporarily.
We'll see.
But the thing where the argument for any dissociative trauma loses weight is the fact that he was harming animals and has a history of doing so beforehand. Now, granted, he has a disruptive childhood that is full of trauma, but the fact that he's harming animals is where he starts showing that's the clear marked symptom of express cruelty to helpless animals and people.
I will give you that. I'll give you that. Because he clearly like scalpeled that rat that he cared for in the beginning. This is where I have a little but also this is a good argument too of how this is a movie character and not a real person with mental health.
Oh, of course.
Because I think I think his presentation, I assume that Rob Zombie's aim was more conduct disorder, antisocial, sociopathic stuff.
Sure.
Because that's the mythos of Michael Myers.
Right.
But he tried to give him more weight, which I think is what muddied the waters, ironically, of him being a clear-cut conduct disorder person diagnosis. Because he does things that don't quite make sense to me for, like, conduct disorder, or the things that I think I'd really struggle if I was working with this kid, which we can get to later, of what's going on. Because... like I said, because I guess when I say, I'm using these terms very loosely. Dissociative trauma is not really a diagnosis either. Like, you can have post-traumatic stress disorder with dissociative symptoms.
Yeah.
And we kind of touched upon dissociation in Psycho with dissociative identity disorder, which is like the granddaddy of dissociative disorders. Mm-hmm. But dissociating is whenever you kind of separate from the reality of what's currently happening. So either your brain goes on vacation, almost like a daydream, to escape your situation. With dissociative identity, it goes so far that you become a whole different person in those moments. Or it could just be like dissociative fugue state, which is where it's like amnesia. Like like something really horrible happens, usually trauma based, and you wake up and it's 3 days later and you don't know what happened the whole time. And usually you act atypical of your personality during those 3 days, but it's not a full-fledged another personality.
Right.
It's usually just weird, foggy amnesia-ness, and then it might be a one-off, like that might just happen to you once.
It doesn't develop into anything else because it's based around the trauma that you have.
Realistic example: Agatha Christie went missing for 2 weeks. And everyone looked for her, and then they found her, and she was like, what's the big deal? And some hypothesized that maybe she had been in a dissociative fugue. There's some movies that talk about, I can't think on the top of my head, but anyway, I digress. And so another version of dissociating is called depersonalization. And you also see that with PTSD sometimes, which is where you don't feel like you are yourself. Like you feel like you're, how do I put this? Like... what's happening isn't really happening to you. Am I saying that right, Hannah? Do you think like depersonalization? Or like you're another person it's happening to, but not you, like you're watching it happen to yourself, but it's not you? I'm trying to think of a better way to say it.
It's kind of like the human part of you doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. And you're just there. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's not like a better way, which makes a lot of sense with the masks.
How it's been described to me by clients who have had PTSD with like depersonalization is sort of like an out-of-body experience. Like they're watching themselves from like above, like they're astral projecting out of their body, and they're above their body looking down on what's happening to them.
Yeah.
Right.
Because what it is your brain's protecting you from this trauma by separating you somehow.
Exactly.
And so I think what I thought made this movie kind of the remake way more interesting in terms of the Michael Myers character is that they really seem to stress this mask thing with him, that he wears the mask to almost separate himself from his environment, like to the point that it becomes this like pathological thing he does when he's a quote unquote bad person or doing bad things. And they really lay it on thick with the mask stuff, which Jesus. I think is not indicative of conduct disorder, is more indicative of, because in conduct disorder, you could make the argument that a kid or a person with those tendencies wouldn't have to depersonalize or wear a mask because they wouldn't give a shit. They're just doing their thing. They don't need to be another person or have they don't need to have a way to hide, or persona about it. They're like, fuck it, like this is who I am, like
I'm gonna do what I want to get my needs met.
But it seems like he really relies on this mask or to hide himself. Even in the beginning, I mean, in the beginning of the movie, he's wearing that mask in his bedroom when he, I assume, murders that rat.
Yeah,
and then he wears it later to her, and it seems like that's a real trigger for his behaviors. Even as an adult, like he wears the mask when he's doing something very brutal, and he takes the mask off in the end, like with Laurie, when he's wanting to be kid Michael again, like a human again.
Yeah.
And so we don't have enough evidence, in my opinion, for like a full blown like other identity, because he doesn't talk. And he doesn't seem like you would have to really be able to like assess him to figure that out.
Yeah.
But I think, let's say he is being honest about not remembering the murders and being kind of like, why can't I go home, Mom? Like, when am I going home? Like, that to me could be read as a person who totally dissociated what he did because of his trauma.
Yep. The
trauma of all the home situations before the murders, and then the trauma of committing the murders, and not being able to really reconcile himself, like the human himself, with the person who did those awful things. And so it definitely seems like there is a separation of identity, and that one identity does conduct disorder, antisocial things. But it does seem like there is a clear separation that Rob Zombie was illustrating by the usage of masks. And so I think that's why my inclination is to lean more towards almost like he was in a fugue state, because of the argument I made that he is so flat when he's murdering his family.
Right.
Very different than, because even when he's beating the shit out of that kid in the woods, even when he's in that fight in the bathroom, like he is upset. Like he's responding. He's reacting to his environment. He's in a rage, which you would just say is a kid who's from a trauma household. And that's how he's been taught to handle himself. I mean, like you said, like he tells the principal, fuck you, because his mom says fuck you. And so this felt very different. Like I remember saying out loud to Hannah when we watched it, like his face is very different. It's like he's so calm and casual. It's almost like he slipped into another state of being. Yeah. Like you would see with maybe like dissociative identity disorder. Where
he definitely slips. Slips.
But I don't think that matches with conduct disorder. Because with conduct disorder, there's more of like, the kids I've worked with who have it, there is more of a, and I don't want to generalize them because they are children and I'm very weary of that. There is a lot more of a, so what? Like there's a very much like a cockiness to it when I've worked with it. And I worked with more extreme cases where these kids are being like expelled from kindergarten and stuff, where there's a real brassiness and brazenness about it. Like they don't feel like they gotta hide. And if they do, it's like they're lying to me with a smirk on their face, but it's all very obvious. Whereas this kid, and maybe because this kid's a good actor, I felt for him even after it. Like it definitely, I felt like there was, even if he was lying to himself because he couldn't admit what he did, it didn't feel like a manipulation.
It didn't.
But I would also, and then I'll be done, I would also argue that because of the work I've done and because I've worked with a lot of adults who are very quick, and when I say a lot of adults, I mean not mental health people. Like I've worked with a lot of school staff and parents and family members, adult family members, who are very quick to write off very small children even as manipulative and as evil in a way that makes my heart hurt. And so I try to be very like, even if the kid's lying to me, like, what are we trying to do with the kid when we're working with him? We're trying to make him a better person. And so you have to believe that they can be a better person. And so you have to be really wary of using terms like manipulation and things like that, because then you're framing this kid as being like this evil mastermind that's going to put you in a headspace about the kid that's going to go nowhere, because you're going to lose empathy for the kid as the show goes on. And then also there's a book about it. Cannot remember it because I'm very bad at remembering about books, but that is specifically about that children can't be manipulators like that, and that parents need to stop doing that, because I think it's giving kids too much credit for their brain development.
Well, right. And I mean, that's true from just having a child. One of the things that they covered with us, even in child classes, is that below a certain age, kids cannot manipulate. They're not manipulating. They're not trying to make you do something. They're trying to get a need met. Mm-hmm. And that's it.
And even when they lie to you,
biological drive.
Even when they lie to you, it's because they don't want to be in trouble, or it's because they don't want you to be mad at them, or they're scared usually of something, and it's not usually because they're like a mastermind of any kind.
Exactly.
But I mean, that's my whole TED Talk about why I think that's Michael Myers. I think the way he's portrayed in the remake is very much more like there's a dissociative thing happening.
Yeah. So I think that, I agree. And I think that whenever we look at that, all of the research that we're getting now versus them not really having all this information before is that trauma has much more of an effect than really anything else.
It gives you brain damage. Literally.
It literally can shape your brain in a different way because of how your body is receiving what is happening to you.
Correct.
So I really feel like he has some like dissociative something is going on, especially because it really seems like in the remake that he is reacting when he is triggered. The animals, I feel like, look, if you're in a situation where you are being a victim or you are being hurt and you don't have any control over anything, you don't know when you're going to eat, you don't know when you're going to, there's no way that you know when you can be safe. Wouldn't it make some sense in some way that you would have control over another, something that's smaller than you, and tortured in the same way that you feel like you're being tortured? I know that that's a huge sign for conduct disorder, and I get that, but I also feel like, I don't know, man.
Well, I guess here's another example. He's very sweet to his baby sister. He's very sweet to her. He calls her Boo. He kisses her on the head. He's very sweet to his mom, too, when he's able. Like, he tells her she looks really pretty. And he seems to have genuine love and compassion for those two characters. Way more his baby sister. In a way that I think... When I think this is because it's a fictional character, flies in the face of someone that is torturing animals. And because he's not living in a household where he's being told to be good to his baby sister. Like, they could give a fuck if he's nice to his baby sister. So all that behavior he's exhibiting towards her is motivated internally. And he's connected to the picture of like his baby sister.
Yeah, I was going to say, so then we have that example. And then what happens is he is, I can't remember what happens before he kills all of them on Halloween.
He goes home and no one's
he goes
really
home
taking care
and
of
nobody's
him and he's hungry.
Yeah, and he's hungry, and this has probably happened 1,000 times in his life. And again, when somebody is experiencing dissociative symptoms, they can look blank-faced. That is one of the things that can happen. And so and I agree that, again, and that's probably because it's a movie version, and that's why this seems so murky and why we're confused about it. But I think that it's so clear to me that that is what happened with him. And also the fact that everybody in that house is mean to him. Mm-hmm. Nobody shows him any kindness besides the baby because she really doesn't have a choice. The other thing that I think really kind of like made my hair stand up on the back of my neck was the way that baby cried. I don't know where they got that cry from, but I don't have any children currently, but I've been around a lot of babies for a really long time. That cry that baby has is one of just, that baby is scared. That baby is hungry. That baby does not feel loved or attached to anyone. The baby was kind of screaming. So to hear that in my head and to know that the baby is already experiencing those kinds of things, the chances that his whole life has been like that up to that point just makes me feel like, yeah, like his trauma is so severe that there is a chance that in order to protect himself, he has this dissociative part of him. And it also makes me wonder, and again, this is like that thing where we just make up stuff, but I was wondering if his father who died had sexually abused him, because that would be another way, like we talked about in Psycho, where if you have to protect yourself and you have to have this stronger character who can take care of you, you dissociate and that stronger character comes out. For him, it's the character with the mask.
I would make a stronger argument that Ronnie might be doing something.
Yeah,
I would agree with that, because we see, at least the sister didn't know about it, because the way the sister got defensive with the boyfriend about the dad dying indicated that she had a positive feeling about her dad. Or was at least upset that he was dead. I don't think she would have been defensive that
like
Ronnie
he's in
was
heaven.
Dead. Right.
She would be like, he's in fucking hell if he was like a piece of shit.
Right. My dad's in heaven, okay? Like, it was very, like, this was a painful moment, and...
Okay, so then maybe, but either way, though, I think he's experienced enough trauma that I don't know that adding the sexual abuse piece would be that important, because he's still in a situation where he doesn't have any control over anything. Mm-hmm. So he gets triggered by, again, coming home. Nobody cares about him. He's getting bullied at school. Everybody's a dick to him. He kills everybody.
It's almost just like he snapped.
Yeah. Like, he couldn't take anymore. He's 10 years old. He couldn't fucking take anymore. Puts a mask on. He takes care of the problem. He doesn't hurt the baby, is holding on to the baby, waiting for his mom to come home. The next time when he stabs the nurse is because the mom brings a picture of him and the baby.
And he's got that mask on, so it seems like he's really trying to... And this is very movie. This isn't, real life.
Yeah.
So we're just hypothetically psychiatring this. But, like, it seems like he's wearing the mask more and more. It's almost like he's regressing because he's being confronted by the reality that he's in this place because he did something bad, which I think is something he can't really confront.
Yeah.
And so he's regressing more and more into this other persona with the mask. And so when his mom brings that picture, he's being triggered by confronting those two realities.
Yeah.
That I'm deciding now that I'm this mask bad person, and you're confronting me with my other persona, and I can't deal with that. So I'm going to,
so I'm going to act
double
out.
down
Yeah.
on being a psycho.
And she verbally abused him.
The nurse?
The nurse did. Oh. The nurse said something really... She said something really shitty to him.
Yeah.
And then turned her back on him, which is one of the dumbest things you can ever do on anybody.
The amount of things that they do in these fucking psychiatric facilities is fucking believable.
I wrote an underline.
Yeah, kid alone.
This hospital has horrible precautions. But we can get into that when we get into why Dr. Loomis is trash.
Yeah. Right.
So the next trigger is, so then that happens, he stabs the nurse. The next time he acts out, because he's chained up and in prison forever, is when Dr. Loomis, who's a fucking piece of garbage, does probably the worst ending session that he could have done. Basically says, you're my best friend, I really like you, but also I have to leave forever, bye. And just ends the session. And then, surprise, surprise, he kills everybody. Because it's, again, somebody who he thought cared about him, leaving him.
Which I guess we could go into another layer of this, which we haven't even touched upon.
The guy breaking into his room with the other, like, the redneck dude breaking into his room and, like, raping the girl in front of him.
What?
What are you talking about?
Did you guys miss that part?
We watched the AMC television version of this movie, so that must have been edited out.
So where he really gets out is because... Do you remember when Danny Trejo's character, the guy that'd been, like, nice to him...
No, I know who Danny Trejo is.
Yeah, so Danny Trejo's character has been really nice to him, is, like, on break or whatever, and this asshole guy that he introduced him to brings in his cousin, and they rape another patient in Michael's room.
Whoa, that was excluded. But you know what? I don't think it needed to be in that movie.
Agreed.
Well, I mean, that's how he got out.
I thought he got out because he just snapped his chains.
No,
that's what happened in the version we watched.
Yeah, no, they raped a. They were. I don't know if they were, like, just trying to do it in front of Michael because they didn't think he would do anything, or because they were trying to get him.
I'll tell you this right now. That is some final thoughts, but this is like that's gratuitous garbage that does not need to be in movies, because the version we watched on AMC was perfectly fine the way it was, which is he's this bad termination with his psychiatrist of 15 years. Yeah. So then when he's being transferred, he's like, fuck this shit, and he snaps his chains and just murders everybody. So this whole raping thing, I believe you. But raping thing was totally unnecessary to the plot.
If you've ever seen any of Rob Zombie's movies before, any of the other ones,
his shit is always gratuitous.
It always goes way beyond. There's a lot of violence towards
this is
women.
Another discussion.
Is a whole nother discussion. House of a Thousand Corpses is the most disturbing fucking thing I've seen in my life.
We'll never see it.
Don't. But especially Hannah,
I know.
You can't do it. But where we start, so we have this debate of conduct versus dissociative trauma. So what is the information here that's missing that would allow us to be more precise in making a more concrete type of diagnosis with this between
Well, I think
these
what's
two?
really hard, this is another layer as well, not to like keep doing this, but all the attachment stuff we're talking about, because all the triggers you're talking about, Hannah, are
Based
where he's
around
been
it.
attached. And it's kind of reminiscent of a whole nother diagnosis, which is
Yeah.
reactive attachment disorder, which you would see only, which is in children. You
Yeah.
give it to children, but can be also an early, possibly if you have antisocial as an adult, you might have had reactive attachment. And all that means is that you have really poor attachments because of, he's got the markers, childhood neglects, poor role models, basically, who are destructive. And you have a hard time attaching. And so where I see his behaviors, anecdotal, like that matches some like anecdotal evidence of when I've worked with kids' reactive attachment, is sometimes when you give them a positive relationship, because they're so used to this identity of being bad because of their abuse, when you try to give them a positive situation, they might wig out on you and double down on being like a bad kid. So like if you try to
Which
be
is exactly
emotionally connected to them, like say if you adopted a kid who had reactive attachment, you try to connect with them, they might go, oh yeah, and they'll like rip up their room or they'll hit you in the face.
Do you still love me now?
Do you still love me now?
When
and
I
so
act
I
like
think
this.
in those situations, like when he gets the picture from his mom and then he stabs the nurse. I mean, this is a crazy extreme example, but it's like I've seen it with kids where like you give them praise and then they'll all of a sudden just cut off all their hair or like trash the room, and it seems like comes out of nowhere. But what you realize is that it's too scary to change the narrative of who they think they are. Yeah. So they double down, which seems illogical to a mentally healthy person, but they'll double down on their identity of being bad because that's at least where they feel safe.
Right.
And that's also might be where they've spent most of their time.
Yeah.
Correct.
So I think one more thing, and then we can stop talking about this. So the only other thing that I really noticed is that when he does get out, after he murders everybody at the prison, and he goes back to the town,
Right.
and he basically completely recreates his trauma. They show the scene where he stabs the girl and she's crawling away from him. That's the same as what happened with his sister.
In the remake.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And so all of those things...
Like bringing the tombstone of his sister into his old house and then bringing Lori there. It's like he's trying to set the stage of his trauma of his murder that he did when he was little.
Yeah. And so then he comes in and then he has Lori there. He pulls her out there screaming and stuff. And then he completely submits to her, which again shows, because after he murders everybody, he goes and gets the baby and cuddles the baby and is sweet with the baby because he really loves the baby. So I think
he kind of thought that he was saving his mom and the baby from their life.
Yeah.
Like now we're good. Like when mom comes home, the energy I get off of him, which is an assumption, is like, okay, I got the baby, I took care of the problems, and now you and me can just
can be happy now.
Yeah. And that's not something I would necessarily see with a kid with conduct disorder.
Exactly. That whole part. So what's really interesting to me is what I wish we could know, which we don't, is when he submits to her.
At the very end.
At the very end, when he recreates the trauma and he puts the knife down and takes the picture out, trying to show her, look, like, we're a family. Like, this is you and me. And then, of course, because she doesn't know anything about any of what's happening, has a really negative reaction, even though she does kind of try to manage it. But he puts the knife down, he slumps down, he puts his head down. He's completely in a submissive position. It'd be really interesting to know if she would have remembered him or something and like hugged him, how different the rest of that would have
been
went.
like, oh, you're my brother.
Oh, you're my brother. Or had recognized him in any way where he could take the mask off and be himself again.
I think
so. That's why the trauma piece for me feels like makes more sense than conduct. But also I think it's messy because it's in a movie.
Well, it's also in a movie, and the other thing,
organized in conduct. Like he would just be doing it to do it. And he seems to have a real objective in both the movies.
He definitely has an objective, but the thing that I have to ask then is, for those that don't know, is it possible for these to exist together?
Here's a real well, I guess here's a bigger, messier discussion is someone really conducts disorder, have that disorder, if he or she's living in a household where all these behaviors are being modeled for him. So now we're getting into the nature versus nurture debate,
it would be a
which
tough
is much
thing.
bigger.
I think the thing that we need
if you took this kid out of his environment, would he chill out? And if you took and put him in a different environment, would he change? And I think that's experimental,
the critical information.
But that's the critical information. So like once he's in the hospital, if all those behaviors kind of went away, then you'd be like, okay, this is probably more trauma based.
Yeah.
Because once he's in a safe environment, all the agitators are out of it. Like, is this more like trauma based, or is it? Because if he continues to be aggressive and argumentative and shitty in the institution, then you'd be like, yeah, he's conduct,
right?
Or he has conduct,
right?
And if like. So the way he kind of behaves, I mean, I know they take it there because he eventually has to become Michael Myers.
Right.
So he has to keep being progressively evil. But I think that would be a big thing if you took him out of his environment. And not necessarily in this situation where you kill everybody in your home, but like a kid that's in a really abusive household and maybe DCFS, like Children's Services, removes the kid and puts him in a foster system. There's going to be some attachment stuff anyway, so that always will be kind of murky. But are they continuing these behaviors that are purely like
malicious,
like hurting the animals, beating kids up, where it's untriggered and seems more? Because also part of it too, and this is going to sound more woo-woo-y and not as substantive, is when you work with a kid that has more conduct disorder behaviors, it's a lot harder to build rapport because they're just not invested in your relationship, because you could make the argument, especially if it's more antisocial, that they don't really care about relationships and they don't care about building a relationship because they don't connect with people.
No, they don't.
And so when I've worked with kids who have conduct disorder or are presenting with similar things, it's really hard to feel connected to them. And I know that's subjective, and it's like, I don't want people to like go take that and run with it because that's so intuition based, and it's like not always true.
Yeah.
Because I've worked with kids that have these behaviors, but there's pain behind it too. So if they're talking about it and they're visibly upset, and so it'd be a lot more like subjective rapport building, which is like horribly messy.
Yeah.
Like in describing and trying to like be objective about it. But also I think you would probably, there's assessments you can give that kind of distinguish. Like I would give assessments, like when you give PTSD assessments to children, there'll be questions like, I can't see my future, or I don't think I have a future. And kids with PTSD will mark really high on that in terms of the higher the score, the more you have these PTSD
Right,
symptoms.
well, because they can't see beyond what's
and
happening to them to know that they're even safe to even have a future.
And so these kids might exhibit behaviors that are the same as conduct disorder to a certain extent, but there's a hopelessness about it that's more like their environment and like what they've lived through and their trauma. Whereas kids with conduct disorder are more able to like see a future and are more hopeful about their own selves because they're kind of looking out for themselves.
Because that's all they see. They all focus on.
And so that would be, you can give these, you could give childhood, I can't remember the names of it, but like childhood assessment tests that ask about hopelessness. And my assumption is there would be I don't have a lot of data to back this up, but my assumption just in what I've done in my job so far is that there probably would be a big discrepancy between those specific questions, like the hopelessness questions. In a kid that has trauma versus a kid that has conduct disorder. Now you can have both, because if you're growing up in a horrible household where you're being very abused, your conduct disorder behaviors are probably being modeled to you, normalized for you.
Absolutely.
I mean,
And
they're having fucking morning breakfast.
And reinforced.
I guarantee you Ronnie reinforced him hitting kids.
Yeah.
I bet you he reinforced like probably killing a dog.
Yeah.
Probably. I mean, like, so like with...
Like he found this stray.
Look, Ronnie calls the baby it.
Yeah, Ronnie's a D-bag.
Ronnie probably has antisocial personality disorder.
Oh, yeah, either that or he's just severe depression and alcoholism to the point where he's so angry about everything that, and maybe even PTSD from his injury. We don't know how he was hurt.
And
but
I think,
we think there's so many things that are
and
back forth.
You have to do family work. That'd be a big part of it too. Is I'd have to work with the family and be like, are they exhibiting? Because if the family changes their behavior and then the kid can go along with it, then that's more indicative of trauma and other mental health things versus conduct disorder.
Right. I would never dispute that this character has trauma. And what I would dispute though is that I don't know that he's necessarily going into a dissociative state versus he's choosing to enter a different part of himself to allow himself to engage in the behaviors he really wants to do.
I guess that's the question that we could hypothetically ask is, how different is that from depersonalizing, though?
I don't think it is.
Because you're still trying to, like, separate a persona.
Right. I don't think it's different from that. I think the intent of it would be where you're looking at, are we talking about conduct in this case, or are we talking about someone who is dissociating and engaging in behaviors? Is like, what is the intent behind it, which is what we can't tell from this movie, is like, what is his intent?
For sure. Yeah, we can't tell that.
What is his motivation? Is him putting on the mask him giving himself permission to be evil? Or is that him needing to separate and pull out away? Like, that's where it becomes a determining factor. And for me, like, where the tone of this becomes and where it solidifies into he's become antisocial as an adult. I mean, I think RAD is probably a more accurate diagnosis than reactive attachment is more accurate than any of the things we've discussed. But I think that when we're looking at what he does to the mental health worker who works at the hospital, played by Danny Trejo, the only person who's been nice to him, and then, like, as he's indicating, like, I've been good to you, he brutally murders him with no remorse. This is where it starts to show those antisocial things where he's seeing a person as a means to an end,
but this
rather
is where
than
I'll
having
call,
an actual connection.
This is where I'll call bullshit on movie magic then.
It's
because
totally
him killing Danny Trejo, who he has a much more significant relationship with, but then not choosing to kill his baby sister, who he does not know and has had no relationship with other than when he was a kid 15 years ago, those two behaviors don't match up. And I think that's why we're having this argument.
Yeah.
Is because he's demonstrating behaviors because he's a fictional character.
Yeah.
And both kill that worker and then not kill Lori.
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense.
Well, unless he always has this idealized version of Lori in his head. But I mean, that
still requires him having, like, a connection,
right,
having empathy for her, wanting to be connected to her, wanting to be a person, whatever that means. Yeah. And so that flies in the face of this whole
wanting to be a big brother.
Yeah. And so, I mean, because I think, and this is me just, like, with some, like, a pill, swallowing a pill about it, but I think because I work with children and because of my experience, I'm just really weary of the argument that this movie, I think both movies try to make, which is that, especially this fucking Dr. Loomis, and we'll get into him next, is that people can be born evil and that you can decide that about them when they're very young, which I think is very bad.
Yeah, I think, and it
very
also,
dangerous.
It's very dangerous, and it likely never tells the whole story. For someone to enter that kind of state where they are that cruel, are there people who are born like that? Is a question that has been around for a long time.
We also can't generalize that either.
We can't, but, like, if you look at all of the psychopaths that have actually been examined and turned out to be serial killers, I don't believe I know a case of one of them that was not severely abused.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Rep another podcast. My Favorite Murder is one of my faves, and all they do is talk about, like, serial killers, and they usually do, like, the whole, like, build above the murderer's life up until the murders, and there's almost always trauma. There's almost always, like, a traumatic brain injury, like getting bopped on the head, being dropped, when they're very young. Like, that's very common. Or they have a family that tortures them or very normalizes this kind of behavior. And so
correct.
It makes me curious, and I don't know if I don't have any evidence to back this up, like, if there is any sort of, like, quote unquote psychopaths, serial killers that have been created in a vacuum where they had a perfectly fine life. Like, because even kids I've worked with who on paper had a very good life are usually kids that had some sort of genetic issue because they were adopted and their birth mother maybe, like, did drugs, or they have some sort of, like, fragile chromosomal issue. But that's also that I don't want to generalize that either, that would make you like a cold person and, like, no empathy, like, a quote unquote psychopath. And so but even in those cases, like I said, like, I've never heard of a person who is just a bad person and that they can't be redeemed in some or given some empathy.
No.
Nope. And so we can launch right into Dr. Loomis. In the original and the remake, Dr. Loomis is
trash.
Absolute trash. I wrote most of my notes are saying this psychiatrist is wild. His assessment is trash. he's so extra. Fuck this guy. In both of them. In the remake, I almost felt like maybe he'd be better.
Yeah.
And then it fuck this guy-ness happened when he is giving a fucking lecture where he wrote a book about Michael after making himself Michael's confidant and like parent figure.
Yeah.
He is then used Michael to get famous, write this book called The Devil's Eyes, which is horrible, and then use a picture of him as a child
and
to convey this evilness.
His real name.
Yes.
Yeah, there's all sorts of ethical problems. Like, I felt like the Malcolm McDowell version of Dr. Loomis started out...
Which is the remake.
In the Rob Zombie version, he started out...
Much better.
Much better, like showing empathy, like really trying to work with them, showing a lot of the things that you would see in a qualified mental health professional working with someone, like going like, no, we can't leave, I'm sorry, like, and being very patient and very kind, trying to explain things to him and work with him and going like, well, we have to get you better, you're not better, I'm not convinced you're better. And
what
then
he does that's beautiful is that after the murders, when he's visiting him in the psych hospital, is he does not treat him like he's bad. Like, he treats him like he's still a boy. He doesn't hold a grudge against him about his behavior. He's not malicious to him at all. He treats him like a kid, which is how you would help a person who maybe has done bad things, like done things like that, to become better, because you still have to make them believe that there's good in them, that you can flourish. And you show that by giving them, like we've talked about Carl Rogers, unconditional positive regard. Now, where he fucks that up is it clearly was not his intention, because he writes that goddamn book.
Right, and then they show him like giving lectures and like making money and clearly like elevating his social status on the pain and horrible life that this former client of his has lived. And because this client's murder story is sensationalized in the media and in the town, he capitalizes that and his relationship with him to make money. That is a horrible, horrible ethical violation. Yeah. He would lose his license immediately.
Yeah.
Like, he would be dragged before the disciplinary board and fined a lot of money.
He would never be able to get his license back.
Well,
no. It would not be one of those situations where sometimes people can be redeemed because they seek out treatment or they get help or they do things. No fucking way. This guy would never be able to get his license again. I wrote in my notes, is he licensed? Has he ever been trained in mental health? In the original, mostly. Well, the original, that guy is whack. Well,
Donald Pleasant say he maintains like my role is to protect society from my patient. Like,
well, this is what's wackadoodle about that guy, and this is where I wrote immediately, this guy is not realistic. And this is something that I see a lot in movies with psychiatrists or therapists or mental health professionals, is this like idea that we're like these superhero type people that can like read minds and like read the future and like see someone's insides and tell you what's up. Because like the whole movie, he's like, I know where he'll be and I know what he'll do and like but if you're dealing with someone who's that mentally ill,
his mind.
But if there's someone that mentally ill, there's going to be a certain level of unpredictability that you can't pretend like you know what's going on.
Side note, this kid hasn't fucking talked to him ever.
Yeah,
what the fuck is he even talking about?
Yeah, this kid never spoke to him. So we're supposed to also believe that he didn't speak from 6 to now. So how does he even know?
Years.
So how does he even know that he would go back to that house? Because it would make sense if maybe Michael, all he would ever talked about for the past 15 years was, I need to find my sister. I need to go home. I need to. And so then as soon as I'm talking very fast, apologies.
You are. Yeah.
As soon as Michael disappeared, then you'd be like, well, I know exactly where it's going to go because he's compulsive about that thought and it's obsessive. But he hasn't fucking spoken. And so it would be surprising that he escaped at all. And so the wild assumptions that this doctor makes about him and that his eyes are evil and that he's no blank.
Like,
you could argue he has catatonic schizophrenia with that kind of presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what you would expect. And like the Donald Pleasance version of Dr. Loomis is almost very clearly based on Abraham Van Helsing. Like, he's supposed to be like this monster slayer. Like, basically what he's the one who comes in and shoots him and saves Laurie, and like it's his shooting and his like pursuit. Like, he's like coming at it from the perspective of like the Van Helsing side of like studying and hunting and tracking and learning about this thing.
But it's inappropriate to make him a psychiatrist.
It's very inappropriate to make him a psychiatrist. If he were a researcher following him or a FBI agent or an FBI behavioralist
like
or
a
FBI
profiler.
analyst or a profiler. Any of those things would make sense, but he's supposed to be the one that had been treating him for 15 years.
He
No
wouldn't be
fucking
treating
way.
him. He probably wouldn't even have a psychiatrist because he hasn't fucking spoke in 15 years.
Exactly.
He would just be in an institution, especially back then in the 70s. He would just be walking around, smearing his poop on the walls. Like, he wouldn't be treated.
Well, and then he was also talking about, like, drugging him out of his mind. Like, in the
Thorazine.
beginning of the movie, using Thorazine, where the nurse is asking him, like, he won't even be able to sit up. That's the point.
Him calling him it instead of him right off the bat when the nurse is like, shouldn't we call him him? And he's like, if you say so. And so he's already...
And also the idea that
Yeah.
a psychiatrist also, side note, becomes a fucking detective and carries around a gun. And
he's
then,
working outside his jurisdiction.
and he's
ethical
hanging out with the
jurisdiction.
sheriff. Like, what the fuck is happening in this place?
And telling the sheriff not to send his men out to go look for him? No, just wait and watch here. Like, the sheriff, like, oh, okay, he's already killed a dog and been here, so we'll just come back in an hour. Like, fuck that!
What is this?
What
'Cause,
cop
like,
do
if
you
you
know is
were-
going to be like, I'm not going to go look for this motherfucking murderer who's 6 foot goddamn 8?
Like, he's huge.
Because in
They're not about to find him.
the real world, what would happen, which is kind of more accurately portrayed in the remake, is...
Is it?
I mean, I'm giving it a lot of being generous,
Mm-hmm.
is that, let's say your client escapes from a mental institution. The cops would probably contact you and say, hey, do you have any insight into where he might go, what he might do?
Yes.
And then, but I don't think you would go out. Maybe you'd go out there and you'd hang out at the police station, but usually you'd probably just more be on call by the phone.
Yeah.
Like, you wouldn't be like the person like leading the march to find him. And also, I just think this wild assumption that psychiatrists can like profile and that they can like read the mind and make the assumptions.
Yeah.
Especially like you said, like a client who he hasn't ever really actually spoken to.
Yeah.
Right. Or, here's the other thing. Without probable cause being identified, which there's no probable cause identified, there's no reason to believe he's indicated he intends to harm anybody
Like, he
or
could be
has means to
wandering the
do
woods
so.
for all you know.
You cannot reveal a damn thing to anybody because you would get sued and lose your license. You have no grounds to say, I know this person is dangerous. Now, like, they allude to things that maybe this patient has talked to Dr. Loomis, but he's also not talked in 15 years, so it contradicts itself. But this drives me nuts because as a professional, I cannot talk to the police unless I have probable cause, meaning this patient has indicated to me they have a target, they have a means,
Well, I guess
and they
he
have
did,
intent.
He did rip that nurse out of the car and like he was pretty violent.
I mean, he did.
So
He
that's
showed
probable
violence.
cause. But
you could
you don't
identify
know
that
that
the police
he-
that you need to look for him, but like to be divulging
This
his
whole,
whole life
like,
story
vigilance-
is inappropriate.
I think
is
the
gross.
only contact that would make any sense really would be warning the. Well, I guess they can't warn the girl because.
Well, in the
He
original,
doesn't know.
they're not
If,
family.
like, if-
Right, in the
if-
original, they're not family. I forgot.
Yeah, in like it would make
Maybe in a
sense.
duty to warn situation.
But don't they? But he does.
it's
call,
not. Yeah, it's not like
he
that
does
in the,
call
in it, though.
Laurie's family in the remake, right?
Yeah, he does.
So that's done well.
So that
I
is
guess the biggest ethical concerns, I'm kind of backtracking a little bit, in the remake is, well, in both movies, he takes it in his own hands by getting a gun. That's wild. Like,
Yeah.
what's you gonna kill him yourself? You're not responsible for your clients like that as a psychiatrist
And
to like
also-
take them down.
You know, you also don't want to ever work with somebody that you hope to eventually stop by shooting them. I don't really. That
And
just
I hate,
doesn't.
in the original when he says he basically decided when this kid was 14 that he was pure evil. He says something like, the first 7 years I tried to heal him, and then the last 7 I decided he was no good. And it's like, so you decided this poor kid who's never spoken at 14 is evil? Like, that's
Yeah.
so inappropriate. That's so dangerous, and that's such a cruel thing to do to a child who you literally have no context for. Besides
Exactly.
that they did something very violent when they were young. But even then, especially with the no talking, I would assume something really horrible happened to this kid that led him to
Yeah.
be so aggressive and then to totally become catatonic.
And I think what's another way that he is terrible is in the remake. He does not have good boundaries with his client.
Yeah.
They show him physically hugging him and touching him a lot more than I think would happen. Don't get me wrong, if you ask and have consent, and sometimes a hug is okay because that's what's needed. But the way that he really puts himself in a parent role when he is in the hospital, I think is really inappropriate. And I think that the whole last session that he has with him. Whenever we terminate with a client, whether it's because we both just decide that that's a good time, usually it's something that you know about, you usually try to give...
It's a plan.
It's a plan. You have a plan of how you will say goodbye, because sometimes it can be really hard, and you don't want to cause any other turmoil to happen. So for him to just come in and say, hey, basically, I love you, but also, and you're my best friend, but also I gotta go. I gotta get out of here.
I can't help you anymore.
I can't help you anymore.
You're a lost cause.
Yeah, that's basically what that's saying
you,
to him.
But you suck, so bye.
Yeah.
And making it kind of his fault
and
that
it's
they're
just
not working together anymore.
Yeah, all of those things are inappropriate termination strategies. And, like, I can say, like, from working in a residential setting, some of those things that you're talking about, because I worked in a residential setting for over a year and a half with kids. And one of the things that I can say is that the role of caregiver that you start to take on as like a dormitory staff becomes more parental than you would see as appropriate for this particular provider to have, but you become that person's daily thing. You basically,
well, it makes sense
it's not a parent, but you're a proxy
of
it.
But it makes sense that the orderlies would have that relationship with him.
Right.
Because that's usually what
Right.
happens is more the daily staff. When you work with kids,
Correct.
will take on a more like parental role and
Right.
like caregiver role and be more familiar. And the reason why you have that role too is so that the psychiatrist and the therapist can still remain very much have professional boundaries with them.
Right.
Exactly.
And when we would work with the kids on that level, because we were mental health professionals at that time, was studying for my master's still. We were line staff is basically where we rank.
So you're more like what you would call like almost like an orderly
closer
level.
to where the orderlies were. I mean, you don't have orderlies now. Like you do have
They just don't call them.
mental health. You have
specialists.
behavioral specialists or mental health professionals who aren't people who wait around dressed in white with black bow ties like you see in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest to like provide discipline and order to the patient. You're there to help guide them through their day and get them through, be their point person for their basic needs, where then a licensed professional, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a counselor, etc., would be meeting with them to do the actual treatment portions.
I would say
and that would be like
really-
a protected, isolated time.
A really good representation of that relationship is in the movie Short Term 12 with Brie Larson, where they're in a residential with teenagers. They're not they're not even therapists. They're just kind of the behavior specialist orderly types. And that movie does a beautiful, beautiful job, like heartbreakingly beautiful job of portraying how that nuanced that role is, like you're saying, where you become really familiar and you're like their family, but you're also setting boundaries. And it almost is you become a family proxy in that you're showing them like this is how you model appropriate relationships, good boundaries, like how you can love someone but also set expectations and not hold grudges. Like that movie is beautiful about it. So if you want to learn more about it, I suggest you watch that movie, Short Term 12. But I think one of the things, like we already touched upon, that he does do well as a child therapist is he doesn't hold the grudge with Michael. Like he very much treats Michael like a kid still. But the one thing he says that I can't stand, this right before he gives him a hug, is when Michael's like, I want to go home, which is understandably a reaction he would have, especially if he doesn't recall or can't bring himself to recall what he did.
Right.
When he says, well, you're here because you did really bad things. That is not a good thing to say to a child. Because
taking that moment when he's being vulnerable and saying what he needs and is asking for something, and then you shit all over him and say, well, it's because you did really bad shit, dude.
Because this is a kid that probably on some level already thinks he's really bad. We already established that. So what you probably would say,
He's been told he's bad his whole life.
Yeah.
But so what you would, I
and
would
is now
say,
in an institution proving that he
like
is
this kid
clinically
knows on some level why
bad.
he's there.
Yeah.
And so instead you would say, well, listen, here's the thing. You know what happened with your family? In order to keep you safe, we got to keep you here, and I don't know for how long. And I know that's really hard. And I get that that's really hard. And I would be frustrated too. And I'd be sad too.
Right. And
you validate, you don't ignore what he's saying, but you also don't, if you want this kid to grow and be a better person and feel like they have a chance to be a better person, then you can't be like, well, this is your fault. You're here because you did bad things and you're bad. You have to kind of steer away from the word bad.
You use that and use it as motivation to help them make progress. You go like, I know you want to go home, and that's just not something we can talk about right now. I know that you mentioned that, and we can talk about like that's something you want, but as far as making that happen, that's just not on the table right now. But here's the way that we can work towards getting you in a better space where we can get you better, so we can maybe talk about that in the future.
Absolutely. There's so many other ways that he could have done that. And also, again, making it even more confusing by hugging him. Then he hugs him, so then it's like he's back to this attachment where he's like, okay, so I'm bad, but you're hugging me, but I'm bad.
Right. And
so what does that mean, and how can I trust
honestly,
you?
Even if you use the word bad, I think a better way to say it would have been like, well, you made some bad choices. Because then what you're telling the kid is you're empowering them to realize that you're not a bad person, but you've made bad choices. And because you made bad choices, that means that you can also make good choices.
Right.
And so it's all about choice and not about something that you feel like you had to do or that you need help doing. You always have a choice of what you do. And so that's also a way to be like, you made some choices that led to here. And so now you can make some better choices that will lead you out.
Right.
Possibly.
And like, I've never seen ever, and this is one of our like hard boundaries, is that you never see a provider initiate physical contact ever.
Not like that.
Not like that. Like, you would have,
Especially
the kid
like
go, like,
the
kids would go like, hey, can I have a hug? And then you would be like, oh, yes, of course.
Depends
and,
on
like,
the kid.
I mean, right. But we always created this culture of, like, you have to ask for consent for contact.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like, it has to be appropriate. And if
And
you
he
ask
could have put,
appropriately
like,
and you
his-
haven't done anything wrong, or it's not a game, you're not playing a game, you just want a hug, like, then of course it's going to be okay. Or you say, not right now, but maybe later.
And he could have put his hand on his hand, like that might have been like a better layer of it, like physical comfort, but still having a boundary.
He hugs him and ruffles his hair. It's a very
Very parental.
but also kind of like intimate in a way. Like that's something that only like a parent would probably do.
And with a kid like that who had the home life he had, you don't know that he'll react positively.
No, you don't.
If he had been really abused, maybe whenever he'd been held like that, it was Ronnie like putting him in a chokehold, or like, you know, a kid at school like choking him out. Like you don't know that he even wants to be touched, because I imagine all the touch this kid has had his whole life has been bad touches, negative, aggressive, hurtful touches. Right. So this kid probably doesn't associate touch with comfort.
Probably not. I mean, maybe for his mother, but beyond that, probably not.
I mean, maybe because he comforts his little sister, so that can make the argument. But I think you're taking a real wild chance, the psychiatrist, by
and the psychiatrist doesn't ask him if he wants a hug.
Yeah, he should have asked him.
He doesn't ask him. He just goes in for it, and that's also something that does not happen. If you are a ethically compliant clinical mental health professional, consent is, I mean. It's important in every setting, but especially when we're dealing with children, and especially when they've experienced trauma.
So overall, it seems like Dr. Loomis is probably not somebody anybody would recommend you go
Either iterations. The remake is better, but not good. Also because just the two-sidedness. Yeah. Just the slap in the face that is how he presents to this kid, and then the book lecture made me and Hannah had very verbal reactions. We both yelled, "Fuck this guy," when that happened. And we both wrote it in our notes. Maybe I'll put it on our Instagram. But because it was such a cruel twist of fate. And like, God forbid Michael found out about that, I'd fucking want to kill him too. I mean, I'm saying that with a grain of salt. But like, that would be like such a betrayal, because also what this psychiatrist did was he made himself the main source of comfort to this kid. And saying you're his best friend, that is so wildly inappropriate.
It's so
I could
strange.
Scream.
He used him he abused him the same way that other people in his life have. And again, he's just the worst.
So if we were to start talking about how we would treat Michael Myers,
we kind of touched upon it.
We've touched upon it quite a bit throughout, but if we were to think about original Michael Myers in the 1978 version, is this character redeemable at all?
I feel like we know so little about him. I really feel like I can't give you. I think baby Michael Myers, like right after
6-year-old
the murders, But I get, because also here's the thing too. When he takes off his mask in the original, his face looks weird. Like something's wrong with it. Like deformed in a certain way.
His eye is not in,
and that might just be the lighting, or maybe it's just trying to be scary that his face is fucked up like Darth Vader style. But that insinuates to me that something might be biologically wrong with him.
Right.
In terms of like, has he gotten bopped on the head? Because traumatic brain injuries, TBIs, that's a real indicator. That can be a real indicator of prognosis, because then you have brain damage and you might only be capable of so much.
Yeah.
And so you have to take that in consideration. Not that you'd write someone off, but it helps you to be more generous, and when you're working with someone, about what they're capable of, and to be more kind about that. Like, well, he has a TBI, so I should be a little more kinder to him when he can't do this, or when this is harder, or when we can't. Like, you have to make your goals realistic. So I think if he's not talking, I guess I don't know. Here's also where I feel torn about the original version. He's immediately institutionalized at the age of 6, probably in a very cold, environment.
Well, we look at it's a state hospital in the 70s.
He's not
and the
going to be
60s
loved
at that
on.
point. Like, those are scary places. They are not reminiscent of what we have today at all.
I think it's so
I think
hard.
He's fucked then.
It's so hard to imagine a 6-year-old being in a state hospital with probably so is he in a
warmth.
juvenile situation?
He's probably in a baby asylum.
6.
He's medicated for sure. Like heavy meds. Like back then, we're talking about Haldol and Thorazine. Back then, that's it.
So they're giving a 6-year-old Haldol. I would say that there's no rehabilitation happening at the place that he is at.
Probably
so
not.
I would imagine that it would be very hard for him to be able to make changes on his own in a setting where he's mostly being medicated to shit.
I would say if we were gonna. He's a kid that's not talking. He's a kid that they've decided is that violent. Killed his family. I think he probably, for the safety of everybody involved, probably would have to be institutionalized, at least for like maybe a year or two, to kind of get an idea of like what he's capable of. Like if he continues to exhibit violent behavior. Now, if he's in a semi-catatonic state, that's a whole nother kit and caboodle, because is that psychosis that's presenting very early? You know what I mean? Or is that because there's some brain?
The 6-year-old part just doesn't make any sense.
He'd have to get MRIs to figure out if he's had a TBI, like a traumatic brain injury, that caused him to act like this. Like if there is something going on, is he having commanding hallucinations? Like there's so many what ifs and variables we don't know. Because let's say he goes to the hospital, he's stable for 2 years. A kid who does something this violent, this age, if we're assuming it's because something bad happened to him, I think the only way he's like quote unquote redeemable is, I don't know how he would get better if he doesn't have some sort of loving family situation. And so what that would look like, when I've worked with kids who have done maybe violent stuff that young, not murdering a whole family, but you put them in a foster home where the foster parents are, there's a word for it, like it's a mental health foster home where the parents are foster parents that are also additionally trained to work with kids with significant mental health issues. And so they are better prepared for a kid who might be violent, for a kid who might sneak out, who might get into stuff, who might hoard food. Like they're more prepared for a kid that's going to keep them on their toes for one reason or another. And I think it would have to be how he reacts to that situation, but it would have to be consistent over many years to see how he did. It's just, there's so many what ifs in the original that I don't know.
So what about in the remake? What would we want to do for...
Family. I think what his mom does really well, actually, that I would carry over into real life was, and this I think is crazy that his mom was able to do this, because she does not demonstrate any of this kind of insight prior to the murders. Is she comes to the hospital and she's very sweet to him, and she doesn't hold it against him. She's very loving to him. She goes every week. She holds his hand. She touches him. She's very, very sweet. She tries to make him remember who he is. Like, that would be what I would hope would happen in this situation with a parent. And that's what I would coach a parent to be like, this is how he'll be better, is if we do this and keep him engaged in the few positive relationships that he has.
Right.
And I think that it really felt like she probably had some kind of therapy herself. And I would imagine after having the people killed, she probably needed to see a therapist, because that kind of shift that she has seems...
How she presents at the hospital makes no sense.
It doesn't make any sense if we think about the trauma that she has already been through.
How aggressive she is.
How aggressive she is in the other setting. So I would imagine that she has actually sought out help herself and is able to come in with the support of a good psychiatrist and a good therapist and be able to have these positive interactions. Because I think in that setting, I think that he could have been rehabilitated. I think he could have gotten the help that he needed in the setting.
Released at
in the setting,
21
in the setting that they have him in with the psychiatrist who has no boundaries, who thinks that he's evil, really secretly, and I mean, I just don't.
Well, this is what I would say, and this is what I brought up when I was watching the movie, or was thinking of, is I don't know if I would have let him keep making masks like that.
Yeah,
because
we talked about
Absolutely
that.
That
not.
seems to have really made him regress. And
Yeah.
so I think I would have said, I would have tried to figure out why he wants to make masks, how he feels when he's wearing a mask versus when he's not wearing a mask, what motivates him to wear one, period, what he likes about them, what he doesn't like, blah, 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 blah. Like, he'd process all of that. And then I'd say, okay, here's the thing. I don't think we're going to make masks anymore, but I'm going to teach you things that you can do to replace the masks. Because you want to, if he's using it as the comfort, you don't want to just take that away from him and not give him anything. So you would help him learn other skills. But then I feel like it's separating him from connection. Also, just in session, I would be like, I need you to take it off, buddy, because we gotta be talking to each other. And that's just bad social skills. Like, you could just put it like that. It's not good social skills.
Well, it's bad social skills. And also we're looking, I mean, we don't know enough about this hospital, but I think they make it pretty clear that there are no other kids around.
Yeah.
And
like, there's barely any other people that I
right,
can see.
Right, there's
period.
barely any other people. How's this place open? But also, like, we're not seeing any group modality. He needs to be in groups. He needs trauma treatment. He needs group and individual.
He's isolated as hell.
He needs medication. I think with a kid like this, we would want to see drama and art therapy and play. I mean, by 10, maybe play isn't so much, but drama and art. He could still do it.
Play until person's a grown up.
I don't think this kid would do it, though.
I don't know, because he does have very, like, I mean, he likes to make masks, and that's pretty
It's imaginative, yeah.
It's imaginative. And also, I don't know, maybe I'm reading into it, but I feel like he has a very, like, little kitty energy sometimes to him. And also, I think play might be interesting because he wasn't probably allowed to be a little kid in his household, and so it might help you connect to a more vulnerable part of himself and help him, like, relive his childhood and maybe make a better childhood.
Yeah, I'd like to see drama for those same reasons, but it would also enable him to act it out and to actually, like, try on those behaviors and have an opportunity, like the drama therapy or psychodrama, to have, like, the opportunity to rehearse new roles, because of the way he was raised. He would have to relearn how to interact with a more healthy environment.
Yeah.
And not be this target of abuse throughout his whole life, and it would make him less likely to be bullied if he had a more adaptive functioning or a more adaptive way to function in society.
And it also makes me wonder if because part of his experience has been where he hasn't been able to really mature or to develop, because he probably kind of got stuck in this 10-year-old age if he hasn't been rehabilitated in any way, shape, or form. So letting him experience that again, I think, would also help him mature and maybe help him understand things, because now he can actually experience those things instead of having to take care of himself all the time or take care of the baby and having his mind kind of all, just full of all of the trauma and all of the worries that he has all the time. So I think that, in that kind of a setting, I think that he would have...
I mean, I think it would be interesting.
He would have a chance.
Because he's so connected to his baby sister, I think play in terms of, like, playing house.
Absolutely.
And, like, taking care of a baby. And, like, really building up the nurturing part of him that does seem to be in there. And that seems to be, like, the strongest, best part of him. And so kind of building that up. And... like you said, he needs to be around other kids. He's in isolation, which is probably what's making him crazy too. Like, and by that I mean, like, he seems like he's starting to have, like, psychotic breaks because he's isolated, and that would make anybody, like, lose their mind.
Yeah,
literally.
he is. They show other patients in there, but none of them are the same age as him. Mm-hmm. And his only interactions... he was tried
as an adult. They do make that mention, so
right,
maybe that's why.
Tried him as an adult. I mean, even still, he'd go to a juvenile facility.
Yeah.
And
God knows what happened to him there.
I mean, it probably not a lot of great things. But you would see a more comprehensive treatment model being given where he would be exposed to more people. He'd be exposed to some sort of family-like structure, some sort of more healthy social environment that's monitored and structured. He would not be left alone.
He wouldn't have no metal fucking forks. That's for fucking sure.
Yeah.
Like, the precautions, this is more nitpick. The precautions taken in the remake, in that psych hospital, are crazy.
There'd not be a metal fork in that entire facility.
Like, for instance, him making those masks, even when they've written him off as the crazy, crazy psycho, when they go into his room to, like, when he's an adult to, like, handcuff him up and take him out, he has, like, paintbrushes. He's got string to, like, make those masks.
Yeah, none of those things would be allowed.
Like, he has all these, like, materials that he could easily use as weapons.
Or make a noose. Make strips out of paper mache.
He could stab himself with a paintbrush. He could stab you with a paintbrush.
The fact that he is so dangerous that they have to chain him to himself just to take him out of the cell, but yet he has all of these supplies.
And they don't search his body, so he could have like a paintbrush shiv in his sock.
Yeah,
for all they know.
Doesn't make any sense.
And I think it just, that to me was very like troubling, because also like when he's interviewing him, it doesn't make sense that he's wearing regular clothes like jeans and stuff, because one, he's already in this intense psych hospital, and why wouldn't he be in like a Scrubs kind of situation?
Yeah.
And then also like with kids I work with who have had dangerous tendencies, like just to be on the safe side, but you don't try to make it about them being unsafe. You're just like, nobody gets to do this. You just make it like rules, like ground rules for everybody is like, you don't have like scissors. Like if you want scissors, you got to ask for them and you have to use them in front of us. Like there's a lot, and they're like safety scissors that don't cut shit. And like, there's a lot of precautions. Like in the very first scene, right after he killed his whole family and he's having his first session with Dr. Loomis, he's drinking out of, I think, a glass, like a glass. Dr. Loomis is a ceramic mug. Like all these things that could be weapons.
None of those things.
And they haven't determined yet how violent this kid is.
Yeah, they don't know anything about it.
They don't, and he has like a pen, and he's being so lackadaisical. They have that huge recording machine. Also, to immediately start recording sessions like that in such an obvious way is not okay, because you're trying, because what you would hope to do is bring this kid back to a quote unquote normal state, which is making them not feel like a rat in a cage who's being analyzed.
Right.
So having a ginormous recording machine already in a clinical room that's huge, in a weird setting where he's the only child.
That's probably already being fucking recorded anyway.
Well, also, we have one thing we have to though remember before we get too much on the machine is that remember that the time period.
But they didn't have to record
machines
it,
were bigger then. I mean, like in order to, that would have been a normal site at that time period.
Maybe.
But I don't know if maybe it would have been a good idea to record him at all in the beginning. I don't know if maybe they would have to because of the weird circumstances. Maybe that would be an argument. But I'm assuming because of this dude's book later that he was recording it because he was hoping to use it for, you know, his psych swagger.
That's probably
I don't think
true.
he was recording it out of like safety precautions, because he clearly didn't give a fuck about him because of the way he was behaving.
Later, well, we also know that, I mean, maybe throughout years that he might have been manipulated, or people might have been leaning on him to like, hey, you should write a book or whatever. But there's a lot of things. It would be hard to come up with like a cohesive treatment plan because we know so little about this character,
especially in the original. In the original, it's like
well, we know nothing.
Because I mean, honestly, in the original, he could have like a brain. Like it could be that you get him to do an MRI. There's something wrong with his noggin, and you have to medicate that part of it, or maybe he's just like never gonna get better than this, and so you just kind of keep him safe in an institution. Like, it's so hard to gauge why he's the way he is, because the way he's presenting is so extreme for his age.
Right. Well, like, and that's the difference between the two movies. Like, if we move into like kind of like our final thoughts on it here, like this movie is reimagined for a reason. Is the first one was a slasher film. It's a monster movie.
He wasn't supposed to be a fully fledged human being.
He was supposed to be a demon.
Yeah.
He's a demon.
Yeah.
He's a monster. He's a supernatural being almost, because he can't be really killed. Like, he's shot 6 times with a .45 caliber weapon. Like,
and he's like an average sized dude too.
Right. You're not getting up from that. Like, that's one of those is not enough.
At least in the remake, he's like gigantic. And that adds to kind of like why he's able to do the things he does. Like in both movies, he rips a tombstone out of the ground
and transports
it. A
They used like small cranes to fucking put those things in, man.
Yeah.
He just carried around. No.
I mean, he could have done it with the car, but like still, the mythos on this is like they alluded that he's carrying this.
But
thing.
it was upstairs. I don't like that. I don't like that.
We just had a weird
He
noise
was
in the room.
upstairs. He carried upstairs to that bedroom where that girl was. He didn't drive the car up the stairs.
Nope, he carried it. But
Anyway,
so like
it
we
doesn't
look
make
at this.
sense.
So like the first one is like the start of the slashers. It's a
Yeah.
classic film.
Yes.
It's the first time that they ever used a steady cam to like make you see through the eyes of a mask, where they're like
Oh.
carrying that around. Mm-hmm. And where this is the first time you got the perspective of the killer, like where you see like they're following Michael around closely from behind, where you don't even really see him. It's the first time they used that kind of like, oh, he's here, he's not there, he's here, and
I mean,
they
it's
used him
very
to like
effective.
stalk and haunt, and he was very effective as a monster.
Absolutely.
The Rob Zombie version did an excellent job of creating a human, not such a great job at doing a monster movie. Like
Yeah.
it felt rushed when they actually got into when they were basically shot for
Yeah.
shot
It was like
redoing.
Lori was barely in it.
Laurie was barely in it. She was kind
It's
of
almost like the remake is from his perspective and the original's from her perspective. It's almost like it's almost like both sides of the same story.
right, and like Laurie didn't have any because Laurie was also the first time where you get like that Sydney type of character where it's like
The good girl.
the good girl,
The final girl.
right? The final girl. That's where that all like came from. Even though the director had like starkly different opinions on that, he's like, you all who think that because she's the virginal one and that's why she survived are wrong. Like, she also then took a phallic object and thrust it multiple times violently into his body. She was the most sexually frustrated. Like, oh, okay,
Well, I
John
don't know
Carpenter,
about that,
I don't know
dude.
about
that
you.
That sounds
there.
like misogyny, but whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 1978 is a different time. But when you look at, I like both of them, but I like Rob Zombie's version a little bit better from the psych perspective because of the way it goes through actually showing how this person was created, what kind of went into his life to make this happen. How did a serial killer get created? I like that a lot, whereas the first one's just a straight-up monster movie that is like inspirational and classic, but it doesn't hold the same emotional weight as showing you like how this happened.
I mean, I agree. I think the original is a better scary movie. Because you're not supposed to have any compassion for him. So he's just this scary thing that lurking in the night or
Right.
in the day. I think that's what makes that movie even more scary is he's just out and about. Like you can't,
The people in
you
that
can't
town.
be confirmed that you are safe in the day, which is very scary.
Yeah.
But I think I am glad we watched both of them because I do like all the nuances, or not even the nuances, like hit you over the head with it, of the psych stuff in the remake are very interesting. But I think because maybe also because I'm a child therapist, it made me like too compassionate towards Michael, and then I was like, oh no, like so then it didn't make sense to me when he goes on this murder spree
Yeah, it was confusing.
because they built you up as like making him like a whole person in my brain. And maybe it is because I work with kids and I've worked with kids who've done questionable things. And so I'm from the more of a mindset of like kids can be better even after they've done something really heinous.
Right. Which is true. But then you see like how also he abandons that.
Well, I think that's also because everybody in his life has done him dirty.
True.
But I do like that. I guess what makes me my final thoughts is that I get very nervous when people watch these kind of movies that they think that the Dr. Loomis in either of these movies is a correct presentation, because I'm assuming they chose to make him a psychiatrist in both movies instead of like an FBI person to give this gravitas of like he really knows what he's talking about because he's a psychiatrist. And
He's a psychologist in Zombies.
well, whatever. But he's a psychiatrist. He's Dr. Loomis in both. I mean, that means he could have a PhD, but whatever. But I think it creates this idea that, one, we know more than we should know. Like, we can see into a person's soul and decide if they're good or bad, which is bananas.
Yeah.
And two, it's just a really bad presentation in different ways of both of these, in both these movies, of like someone with like very poor boundaries and very manipulation kind of stuff in the second one. And then the first one, just like dramatic telenovela-esque psychiatrist who's doing wild shit we would never do and out of his jurisdiction in multiple ways and making wild assumptions all over the place about a child, which is highly problematic.
And portraying a psych patient as dangerous just because they're a psych patient.
Yeah, and so I would say, as a mental professional, I find both these movies offensive. but I like them for what they are. If I wasn't a therapist, does that make sense? Like, I really like the original better because it is genuinely scary, and it scared me when I watched it when I was younger. Mostly because when I first started watching it, I was a babysitter, and so that really hit on that.
Yikes.
like When a Stranger Calls kind of stuff.
Right. Dude, the first time we watched this, we were watching it in a tent in my friend's backyard, and guy...
You dumb dude.
I'm aware that this was dumb. Michael Pierce.
How old were
this
you?
was dumb. 10, 12. Somewhere in there.
Ben. Okay, I'm
we
sorry.
watched
Go
it,
on.
but some dude who was like a crackhead or something
That is the worst case scenario.
came into the backyard, knocked on the tent, and was like asking us for money because he needed an alternator at like midnight.
I would have peed my pants. Legit.
I would have passed
pissed
out.
myself. And then
So that
never-
happened.
and then
So I'm
never
always
slept
like
outside
traumatized
again.
a little bit watching this because I always remember going back to that. Like, we watched this motherfucking movie, watching in a tent, and some crackhead ass dude just like comes out and like starts asking 10-year-olds for money for his alternator.
That's terrifying.
It's terrifying.
Final thoughts. Mike Myers in the zombie version walks too fast. Because I think what's really scary about the original and why I like him more is because he's so slow and he's coming for you, and it's like this dread feeling. But in the other one, walks too fast. All right, I succeed. I cede the floor.
I don't like scary movies.
I think it's like 3 out of 3 now.
I'm never gonna like scary movies.
What's your favorite scary movie?
And I think that this is a really offensive portrayal, both of mental health, somebody struggling with mental health issues and trauma, as well as what a provider looks like. Yeah. And so I'll never watch these movies again.
How many times have you said that?
We should be keeping score about how many movies Hannah says she'll never watch again.
Just saying.
This
Shutter
Island. This
Island.
and Batman Begins.
And Shutter Island.
Yeah. Movies. Yeah. So that's my final thought. I do think that I also felt very strongly for the character in the second movie, Michael Myers, because I think he does a better.
Actor was cute. Was a good actor.
Yeah, I think they did a better job of fleshing out his story, and I did feel bad for him and felt hopeful during some of it, and then it was hard to watch it crumble around him. And so I think, again, just being in the situation of being a mental health professional, it's a kind of a shit story, man. I'm just not really interested in more shit fucking stories about people who are struggling with mental illness. It's
and
not
how they big, bad scary thing eventually.
Yeah.
And don't recover.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I guess
It's not accurate.
No.
So I guess if you also feel this way, circle back and listen to Sixth Sense, in which there's a good therapist and a kid who has a full arc and he gets better and he becomes a positive person.
Yeah.
So, do you have any more final thoughts, Ben?
Nope. I was just going to say thank you for listening, and please be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and email us at Popcorn Psychology if you have any thoughts or questions, disagreements. We are very responsive. We're happy to talk to you. We're very accessible. We're
always taking suggestions.
Always taking suggestions.
And I would say, please rate and review us on iTunes or wherever you listen. That's how people find us. And happy Halloween.